Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Jesse Stockall, Chief Architect at Snow Software. Jesse, it's great to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Today we are mostly going to talk about open source governance and self-hosted open source and managed cloud services. But before we get into the weeds of this topic, I would love to know a bit more about the company itself.
Sure. Snow Software is a leader in software asset management, which is typically looking at the commercial licenses you use, making sure you're not getting audited, making sure that you're not exposing yourself to too much risk. We've also then moving into areas such as cloud management, cost management, endpoints, bringing that all together in what we call technology intelligence, which is insight and manageability across all of your technology devices.
Now, first of all, thanks for explaining that. We live in a world which is powered by open source, driven by open source. But the interesting thing is, a lot of folks who are consuming open source, sometimes they don't even know that they are using, number one. Number two is that they don't even know how to engage with open source in the right manner. There are a lot of seasoned users who do know they have their own open source program offices and stuff, how to deal with that. So talk a bit about what are some of the challenges or pain points you see when it comes to consuming open source by enterprises.
Right. So initially, many years ago, open source governance was all about making sure that you weren't using a GPL license or combining things that would cause you to have to release your source code. And some of the large commercial vendors, such as Microsoft, were kind of spreading a lot of fear about using open source software, and there was a lot of doubt and concern. So there was some tooling. Companies like Black Duck came in, and their whole goal was to prove that you weren't using any licenses that would perhaps let you or force you to give up your source code. As we've transitioned to SaaS delivery, we're not shipping as much software in the way that we used to anymore. So open source governance has now shifted towards supply chain attacks and vulnerabilities. The solar wind attack a couple of years ago comes to mind, where the application itself wasn't vulnerable, but one of the dependencies that it pulled in had something in it. And that's where we're focusing a lot of our attention now, is making sure that what is being pulled in by your developers, they're often not aware of that. There's a deep dependency tree of libraries that gets pulled in into many of the code bases that we work on today. And that's where we spend a lot of our time now, making sure that those dependencies are up to date and free of vulnerabilities, because it can be quite a challenge if you don't have tooling and governance in place.
So let's look at it holistically. When you do look at it, I want to hear your thoughts from the perspective of your users also, because when we talk about open source, there is a philosophical view, there is an ideal view, but then there is a very, you can say realistic view as well.
Right. So the first thing that's really important is to have a clear policy, both around using open source software, but then also contributing back to the community, which is very important, as you say. In a small startup, maybe you have an experienced developer, you can leave it up to a small group of your leaders to figure that out. But as you grow, you need tooling in place, and you need a governance committee that has representatives from legal, from compliance, from security, as well as engineering. You shouldn't be leaving it up to individual developers to make that call, or asking an engineering manager if they can go ahead and open source a project that they've been working on. Maybe it has some of the crown jewels of the company, or maybe it doesn't. But that's something that you shouldn't be leaving up to individuals to figure out. That's something that we feel strongly that you need to have an open source governance committee, and it needs to have the right representation. The second thing is tooling, whether that's tracking your dependencies, making sure that they're technical debt, that they're being resolved, they're not being left off, because it's quite often to say, well, the application is still working. What does it matter if there's a vulnerability 3 layers deep in some chain? Well, if that gets exposed on the internet, or if that gets published to one of your partners, that suddenly becomes a huge problem, and it become very difficult to mitigate those once they're out in production, rather than if you can find them earlier on in the process.
Talk a bit about from the culture perspective. Technological solutions are there. You did touch upon that, but how to have that mindset where you are, as you talked about earlier, not only be a good open source citizen, but also there should be a concept of inner source as well, where the teams are not working in silos. So that we talked about, tribal knowledge should not be there. When the team member move out, all the knowledge is gone with them.
Right, that's actually a really interesting topic. We've internally started what we call an open source governance model. allowing one team to maintain a package, a service, or a library, and allow other people within the organization to contribute to it, submit pull requests, make changes to it. It's even though we're not releasing some of that source code out into the community, out into the world, we are using a lot of those same models that have been proven in the open source world internally at a company like Snow. Maybe when you're a startup, you're all co-located, you're under one roof, you can work on that without a governance model. But we've got developers scattered around the world in different time zones, different backgrounds, and it really makes sense for us to embrace that model internally. And I think this is, you touched on it. People who are coming from certain backgrounds, maybe not have been exposed to using open source, they may not have been exposed to a distributed development model. It's really important to build that into your culture because there's a lot of benefits. You can move faster and you can, reduce the proverbial truck count if you have people who understand or share that knowledge rather than it being retained in a really small group, who limits who can have access or make changes to a code base.
How much are you seeing when you talk about Snow's own internal culture? There are teams who do like internally operate as open source community where the code doesn't have to be released, but internally it is more or less like that. How much are you seeing this practice is out there, or you feel that there is still a lot of organizations who still don't know how open source work, how they should operate, and they need a lot of education and training?
I think that it's still something that is not as prevalent as it probably could be. We still get people who are new to Snow coming or with some of our partners who are not used to that model, and they will copy an entire library or code base and then replicate it themselves rather than contributing their changes back. Then you end up with duplication and multiple code paths that could be shared. I think it's something that it's an opportunity to learn. It's a sign of maturity, I think, when people realize that they can still have control. It's not the Wild West. You're not relinquishing everything, but you can allow that your colleagues and your teammates to enhance something while still retaining that maintainership and keeping the quality bar up. So it's something that you grow into, and I think it's something that can certainly benefit organizations once they get to be a certain size. It probably isn't needed when you're a small 5-person startup and you know everybody by first name and you can go out for lunch together.
Once again, thanks for talking about that. Now, you there's one more thing I want to go back to the previous point that you made was that why to be a good open source citizen, because when you say talk a lot of teams, they can just copy, duplicate. What happens is that when you move too much far from the upstream code base, first of all, if you make any changes, those changes will not be accepted because you have strayed so far from the upstream code base. Second is when a new update comes out, you are so far, you cannot. So you will literally be maintaining a fork, putting a lot of effort and energy in maintaining that fork. So talk a bit about, it's not just, you to be a good citizen to give back. It also makes a lot of sense for your own benefit. It's like self-serving as well.
100%. And that's actually been a bit of a challenge here and at other companies I've worked at as well, convincing management that we should contribute those changes back for exactly the reasons that you said. It's cheaper and easier us in the future if we don't have to maintain that fork. We don't have to keep applying our patches and we're doing all the compatibility testing. We're not necessarily going to enrich a competitor by offering a few lines of code that solves an issue for us. It actually makes our life a lot easier if we can contribute those back. So it is quite self-serving, but done right, it does allow you to be a good open source citizen as well. But in order to do that, you need to make sure that the company supports that. You make sure that you're accounting for developer time being spent there and understanding what the commitment is. Some open source projects may expect you now to dedicate time to support the new feature that you've contributed back. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that you need to be aware of.
Right. Once again, very well said. Now, I also want to talk about we live in a cloud-centric world. Open source, the beauty is that it can very easily solve day one problem. You can download the code, you can get it started. Day two challenges are the bigger problem, and that are the problem for customers as well. That's where we see commercialization of open source, which is critical to the health and survival of open source, where you need new features, where you need support, where you need security. And then there's another thing where, as a service, a lot of cloud providers or other, they offer open source, they package open source, and you can consume easily as a service. So sometimes it becomes, build versus buy kind of decision. So talk a bit about how to maintain the balance, because sometimes you may not have to reinvent the wheel every single time or build your own car just because you want to go somewhere. Bad analogy, but still.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, this is about your core competencies. If you already have a big operations team, they have the skills and capacity to self host, maybe it's cheaper than running the managed service. It's an incremental cost to add another database type or add another piece of infrastructure. And you don't have to bring in new staff or completely bring in new skills. But if you're a small startup or you're a company who's trying to grow into new markets or bring into new business, I using a managed service or a cloud service allows you to focus on delivering that value to your customers and to the market. And you can leverage the expertise and the global presence from that vendor, from that cloud provider. That can be quite time consuming or costly to set up if you don't have that initially. But we do see some customers, they have large operations teams, they have the capacity, they have the skills. For them, it makes sense to self host. So I think there's a balance, but it's really about evaluating what skills you have in house and where do you want to spend your company's time.
Now, I would talk a bit about quickly Snow as a company itself. Talk a bit about how do you folks help, talk about your solutions or your services. How do you folks help, move forward, business continuity through open source?
So Snow's biggest value proposition is visibility of your assets. If you can't see your assets, you can't secure them, you can't manage them, you can't reduce cost or even migrate to a cloud environment if you don't know what you have. So that's the foundation of everything that we do. So we collect data from our own agents, from browser extensions, from third-party sources, from cloud APIs, gather all of that information together and cross-reference it, and then we will start to enhance it. We have a massive what we call our data intelligence service of software titles that we've analyzed over the years. We'll merge that in together with cloud cost data or with vulnerabilities from NIST to start to give you some higher level views on top of that, some insights on top of that raw data. So that many companies are still trying to manage all of their inventory with essentially with a spreadsheet. And I think the cloud world has proved that is not sufficient anymore. The transient nature and the fast-paced world that containers and cloud is, it's almost impossible to use a traditional CMDB or traditional asset management tooling to keep on top of that environment. And that's where Snow really shines, is by bringing all of that data together and allowing you to have decision context that focus on meeting your company goals or saving cost or reducing risk without having to go through all the hassle of collecting all that data yourself.
Excellent. I think now I have everything that I was looking for in today's. I mean, this is a topic we can talk for hours. This is just off-camera comment. I'm just looking at my notes as well. Anything else that you feel like talking, or you think, hey, Swapnil, we should have talked about that. This was critical. We did not even touch upon this. Or you feel that we have a very good first discussion, and we can continue this, in future as well.
No, this was a good first discussion. The only other thing that might be interesting, and I mean, I think open source we're well past convincing people that it's a good idea now. But even in a company of Snow size, we still have the not invented here syndrome. Developers like to develop, they like to write code. And oftentimes there are open source or cloud offerings that would allow you to move quicker. And again, it's back to that focusing on your core competency. If it's not your crown jewels, you shouldn't be necessarily writing a database or another warehouse or another messaging service when there are battle tested and bulletproof things out there from places like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and from our hyperscale cloud providers.
Jesse, thank you so much for taking time out today and, of course, talk about open source governance. And I really love the insight that you shared that actually helps help companies in building an open source kind of strategy policy internally. So they not only become a good open source citizen, but actually they become a self-serving, kind of it benefits them as well. I love those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much.